Judicial review is our topic today. We are covering Colorado State Social Studies Standard for Middle School Civics 2F. Students should be able to explain how state and federal power of judicial review is reflected in our constitutional government. By the end of this podcast, students should be able to define the term judicial review. They should be able to explain how the U.S. Supreme Court expanded its power of judicial review through the very important Marbury versus Madison decision. And finally, they should be able to analyze how the power of judicial review enhanced the federal system of checks and balances. So, what is judicial review? Judicial review is the power of the courts to decide whether laws and actions of government are allowed under the Constitution. A law that has been determined by the courts to be null and void may not be enforced. Such a law is unconstitutional and is not acceptable as a law. How does this power of judicial review apply to laws passed by state governments? Well, first, it is the United States Constitution. It's all federal laws and all national treaties that are the supreme law of the land. This is the Supremacy Clause. The Constitution, the laws passed by Congress, and treaties are the nation's highest laws, and they must be obeyed by the states. The courts had the opportunity to use their power of judicial review for the first time right after the Revolutionary War. After the war, the United States signed a peace treaty with Great Britain. In this treaty, Americans agreed to pay all debts owed to British citizens. However, Virginia, the state of Virginia, passed a law that canceled all debts. The law was in violation. It violated the peace treaty. So the law could not be enforced. Citizens of Virginia had to pay their debts. The next question is, does then the U.S. Supreme Court have this same power over acts of the federal government? The framers of the Constitution meant for the Supreme Court to have this power over acts of the state governments. The Constitution does not state that the court has the power of judicial review over the branches of the federal government. So how was this established? The United States established this power through the Marbury versus Madison decision. This established the Supreme Court's power of judicial review over the other federal government branches. It starts when the second president, John Adams, was voted out of office. Before he left office, he appointed a number of people to office. Now, he did not have time to deliver all of the paperwork. The next president, Thomas Jefferson, when he took office, he ordered his Secretary of State, a man named James Madison, not to deliver the appointments that were left from John Adams. William Marbury was one of the people that was supposed to receive a job, and he believed he was entitled to the job that Adams had appointed him to, even though the paperwork hadn't been delivered. Marbury took his case directly to the Supreme Court because the Judiciary Act stated that he had that right. I have to give you a little bit of background about the Judiciary Act that's not in your notes. The Judiciary Act, Article 3 of the Constitution, sets up the Supreme Court as the highest court of appeals. That means cases need to be heard at a lower level before they make it to the Supreme Court. The Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress said that some cases could go directly to the Supreme Court. So that's what Marbury did. He took his case directly to the Supreme Court. Okay, back to the notes. The court agreed that Marbury should have a job, but they also said that that part of the Judiciary Act that gave Marbury the right to bring his case directly to the Supreme Court was unconstitutional. The Constitution limits which cases go directly to the Supreme Court, and this wasn't one of them. Congress had changed the Constitution when it passed the part of the Supreme Court that allowed people to take their cases directly to the Supreme Court. Congress does not have the power to change the Constitution all by itself. So by declaring part of a law passed by Congress as unconstitutional, the Supreme Court assumed the power of judicial review over the legislative and the executive branches. This is very important because if the Supreme Court could not strike down such acts, there would be no effective way to enforce the constitutional limits on the powers of Congress. If they had not ruled in this case that that part of the Judiciary Act was unconstitutional, there would be no effective way to limit the power of Congress. Again, checks and balances. Everything is balanced and limited. Okay, now that we're done, you need to, on a separate sheet of paper, define the term judicial review, explain how the U.S. Supreme Court established judicial review through the Marbury versus Madison decision, and I'm sorry, that should be enhanced judicial review, and you should be able to analyze how the power of judicial review enhanced the system of checks and balances.